want to talk to you about my new book, Chastity and Soul, from Paraclete Press. Chastity. That's a word today in our culture that it's almost disdained. It's some years ago I was asked to give a talk at a Catholic university, and the dean who invited me said, when we're going to put out the advertisement, we're not going to mention the word chastity or nobody will come. Well, I wrote a book on chastity for this reason. It's a very, very important concept and a very misunderstood concept in our culture. Most people confuse chastity with celibacy. They're not the same thing at all. You can be celibate and not chaste. You can be married and have a healthy sex life and be very chaste. What is chastity? I want to give you two images, which I used in the book. The first one is biblical. You have that beautiful text in scripture where Moses approaches this burning bush, and he approaches out of curiosity. And the voice of the burning bush, God says, Moses, keep your shoes off because the ground you're standing on is holy ground. That's chastity. To always remember there's a sacredness, there's a reverence to everything we do. The second story I use comes from Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer. And in one of his books, he writes this. He said one day he was watching a moth come out of its cocoon. As you know, moths come out of a worm. So he's watching this worm turn into a moth, and it was fascinating. He said, but it was interminably slow. So at a certain point, he got impatient, and then he took a candle and he lit, or he just heated the process so it went faster. So then the moth came out more quickly, but because the process had been rushed, the moth's wings were premature and it couldn't fly. It's an image of chastity. If you rush something, if you don't wait, the end product isn't full. It's interesting. We could say this, that all sins are actually sins of irreverence. Every commandment you break it, there's a certain irreverence, lack of respect, and so on. I want to give you a couple of stories here just for flavor, because chastity is tied very close to the soul. And that's also why we oftentimes identify chastity with sexuality. It's actually much wider than sexuality, but it's very important there. So two stories. There's a professor from Oxford a few years ago published a book called The Right to Sex. And she's a professor at Oxford, and she said she has a colleague, a man, who sleeps with his students, with some of his female students. When she confronted him about that, you're a professor, you're sleeping with your students, he said, what's the big deal? What's the difference if I sleep with this girl or play tennis with her? Well, that reveals something. Tennis has nothing to do with the soul. Sex has things to do with the soul. What's the difference to sleep with somebody or play tennis with them? All the difference in the world. Second story, I had a woman in class some years ago when I was teaching, and I made the students read a book by Christopher DeVink, a New Jersey writer, and it's called Precious Memories for a Faithless Time. And it's simply a series of essays of him as a young father, his relationship to his kids and to his wife. And at the end of the semester, this young woman came into my office, 30 years old, and she says, Father, said that book by DeVink, she said, that is the best book I ever read in my life. Said, I grew up with no moral training, no religious training. Said, and I've slept my way through a couple of states. Said, but now I realize what I want is what he has. I want the marriage bed. I need sex to take me home. Said, up to now, I've always gone home after I've had sex. There's something wrong with that. It has to be home. She was looking for chastity. It's interesting, the Me Too movement is actually a movement for chastity. Women who are standing up to men who hit on them for sex, that's actually a statement for chastity. They're saying, I want proper respect. I want to be reverenced. I want to be, I don't want to be hit upon. That's chastity in essence. It's interesting, chastity or defensive chastity is usually associated with religion, and oftentimes with fundamentalist religion and so on. But back in 1987, a very sophisticated Chicago educator, Ellen Bloom, wrote a book he called the closing of the American mind. And he was a Neoplatonist. He wasn't a Christian. And in the book, he says, I'm teaching all these ultra sophisticated students at the University of Chicago. He said, I would think that their biggest problem in life is lack of chastity. He said, and they have grown erotically lame because they experience things too quickly. There's always impatience and so on. Taste everything, break all taboos. That's a road to sophistication. It's also a road to a certain unhappiness, a certain erotic lameness. So I wrote this book because I felt it's needed, and it's not necessarily a churchy book. I think it'll help churches and those churches who are still, advocating chastity, but it's written for culture as a whole. Our culture, as Ellen Bloom said, we're growing erotically lame because we're lacking chastity in our culture. It's interesting. I opened the book with this line. I said, can anybody today say the word chastity without a cringe? And I ended by saying, yes. You don't have to cringe. You don't have to be a fundamentalist. You don't have to be erotically uptight. Chastity can go together and does go together with wholesome and wholesome sex. It's not celibacy. It's proper respect, patience, and reverence. Thank you.